back again. We're still talking about this fellow named Umar. We're still moving and trying to unpack the Jerusalem thesis, or whatever name you want to call it. We've listened to Paul. We've also listened to Mel. Now we want to go and listen to Joe. Joe is another one that has really helped us understand the Jewish antecedents to what then later became Islam. And Joe, because of his Jewish background, brings a whole different narrative that none of us, at least I've not heard it before. And most of what you have seen so far on my Fandom Films has not really dealt with this side, this category.
Glimpses.
This glimpses. There's Joe already. He's there. He doesn't show his face. You're not going to see who he is. I'm not going to say too much about him. Although I will say Joe has a great YouTube site. It's called Red Judaism. If you look at the comments below, the whole box, the description box, we're going to put his YouTube URL there, so you can go look and see what he's doing, because he comes from a completely different tangent, a completely different historical background, the Jewish background, which we really haven't said much about. And we need to hear that side of it. So Joe, you're there. I heard you come in just a little bit. God bless you for joining us. Thanks for coming on board. Go ahead. And what I would like you to do, Joe, is to give us a whole nother narrative. Show us what we are missing, what we haven't found so far. Because one of the things we have said, and one of the things I will always keep reminding people, anybody who comes on my show, I don't want you to just repeat what's in the 9th and 10th century traditions, the standard Islamic narrative. I don't care about that anymore. I want to see how Islam began from the 7th century. But in order to understand the 7th century, we're going to have to go even before that. And you have a great background, your Jewish background, because of the fact you're reading in that area. You understand it. You understand the whole paradigm, the whole Sadducee paradigm. I want you to help us, walk us through and show us what we're missing, so that we can get a better knowledge of what then became Islam after the 7th century. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for the introduction. So I think probably it'd be a good idea for people to go away and get a cup of tea, come back and sit down and have a listen. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a Jewish history, something which was happening in the 7th century. Let's just explore the Jewish story. And while we're exploring the Jewish story, I think you're going to find a lot of pennies dropping. The penny's going to drop on a lot of things. You say, hold on a second, that's Islam, and that's Islam, that's Islam, that's Islam, it's Islam. But to get there, we have to go to approach it the way I approached it. I mean, I approached Islam only because I was interested in Jewish history in the 7th century. So I was studying Jewish history in the 7th century, and I was looking for artifacts and sources which were going to give me more information about the story of Judaism or Judaisms in the 7th century. And I wasn't convinced that the sources which were appearing, which are claimed by Islam claims these artifacts and sources, I wasn't convinced that they belonged to Islam. I think, no, they seem to me to be belonging to Judaic groups, Judaic religions and movements. And this is why. So starting with, in the beginning of the 7th century, there was a Byzantine emperor called Phocas. Phocas decided that he would force all the Jews in his empire to convert to Christianity. And that caused a mass migration of Jews out of Byzantium territories, and they went and sought refuge in Persia. They didn't have much options, really, although many did go down to Ethiopia as well. But it was basically Persia or nowhere else, really. Very interesting groups of Jews also who were worshipping in synagogues which were built just in the 6th century. For example, Beit Alpha Synagogue, which is a Messianic Jewish synagogue, or Messianic Hebrew synagogue, we can at least call it. And these Messianic Hebrew synagogues had been existing. I mean, there's one in Tiberias, there's one in Beit Shearim, and there's this one in Beit Alpha, which was built in the 6th century. And these Messianic Hebrews were praying in synagogues. They were using Jewish practices, but their synagogues have decorations with images of the Messiah in them. Quite different from Christian churches, but they were forced to convert to Christianity or leave. And so they left and they went to Persia. Now, about the same time in Persia, we have an emperor, Khosrau II. Khosrau II has a disagreement with the leader of the Jews in the Persian Empire and has him executed. And in his place, he appoints somebody called Nehemiah ben Hushiel. Now, the exilarch, just so you don't, in case you know, the exilarch of the Jews means the leader of the Jews in exile. That's called the exilarch. And he lived in Persia, but he gets executed by Khosrau II and is replaced by Nehemiah ben Hushiel, who is a Sadducee Karaite. It's a kind of Jewish movement, but they are very different from what you know as Orthodox Jews or even Reform Jews. It's a completely different movement. You see, Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism is based on the Mishnah, which means the sort of cultural context of how we understand the Torah. For example, the Mishnah tells us that we have one man, one woman in a marriage. Marriage is one man, one woman. That's a marriage, and the Mishnah tells us this. If you were to read the Bible without the Mishnah, I'm talking about the Old Testament, not the New Testament. If you read the Tanakh without the Mishnah, you'd think that it was permissible to have as many wives as you like. But Mishnah says, no, that's not how it is. We interpret things differently. Mishnah also, for example, makes it clear that, yes, you can do things like taking your sheep out of a ditch on Shabbat, whereas a straightforward, simple, literal reading of the Tanakh would give you the impression that was impossible to do. So Mishnah gives sort of, what we can say, gives the kindness, the kinder side of Judaism, which people are generally unaware of because they only read the Bible without the Mishnah, and they think that Judaism must be a very harsh religion from the Old Testament, so they don't have a correct understanding of Judaism, which is much more gentle.
Joe, could we say then that these Sadducees are really they're the radical? They're the radical.
They are
Jews.
radical. They're radical, literal Old Testament text. No, neither add to nor take away any of the words of the Old Testament text, but that they don't have any there's no gentle interpretation of it. It's what it says, that's what you do. It says, go and kill all the Canaanites, burn down all their cities, burn the trees, kill the children, kill the animals. That's what you do. There's no...
These are the literalists, is what you're saying.
Very literal, yes, the literalists. So the Sadducees and the Karaites are literalists. They're literalists. And that's why in modern Judaism, we don't consider them to be Jews, but they are a Judaic movement. Anyway, the point is Nehemiah ben Hushiel gets appointed as the leader of the Jews, which you can imagine is a bit of a problem in the Persian Empire. So what happens in 610? On the 3rd of March in the year 610 AD at 7:30 p.m., there was an interesting event which can be interpreted by the Persian sort of astrologers as a good omen for war, time for Sasan to go to war. And because they were pagans, you have to understand, they took signs from the stars like that. So what we see here is a picture of what this is generated from a computer program of what the moon looked like. There's a thin crescent of a moon you can see coming along here. This is the thin crescent of the moon. You could see this at 7:30 p.m. from Kufa. If you were looking, I believe if you're looking towards the west from Kufa, you would see this thin crescent of the moon. And what happened was this little white dot here, this is the planet Mars, which was behind the moon. And the new moon is, although it looks like there's nothing there, it's actually a big disk. It's just there's no light shining on it, isn't there? There's a sort of disk there. There's no light shining on it. So that Mars is invisible when it's behind the disk, even though there's no light shining on it. And then Mars appears at the corner of the crescent here from behind the moon, and it looks like a kind of a teardrop welling up at the corner of this eye and then dropping off as time goes, as the minutes pass by, Mars sort of pops out from behind the back of the moon. And that is interpreted as Mars coming from Sasan. Sasanian Aram, their symbol was the crescent moon. So Mars is the symbol of war. So war comes from the crescent moon. It's like, oh, it's a good omen. It's a good time to go to war. So they took that as a good omen, I'm suggesting. And this, I think, is important for later, because I think the Arabs interpreted this as the moon splitting. It looks like a little piece of the moon dropping off because they didn't understand it. But actually, what was actually happening is that the planet Mars was emerging from behind the crescent moon. It's called an occultation or a deoccultation of Mars. Occultation means hiding. So there was a deoccultation of Mars from behind the crescent moon at 7:30 p.m. on the 3rd of March in 610 AD. And you can all go and check that up if you, in your own software, if you have some retrocalculation software for looking at the stars and things like that. And so that was an interesting event. What happens after that is indeed Sasan does go to war. They go to war against Phokas. And they use this Nehemiah ben Hushiel, who was the new leader, this Sadducee leader of the Jews who replaced the Exilarch, to lead the army of Jews who they used as basically their footmen, sort of like a vanguard, expendable forces to go ahead of the Persians and conquer the Romans. So they sort of used this as cannon fodder, if you like. So they sent the Jews in, and under Nehemiah ben Hushiel, though, it was actually quite a bloody conquest. They fought like mad. They fought for their lives, but they also fought for their land, because they were invading Jerusalem. They were invading the Holy Land. And you have to understand, it doesn't matter what kind of sect of Jews you are, whether you're Karaite Jews or Sadducee Jews or regular Jews, the Holy Land is the Holy Land. It's our land. So they were fighting for their land, and they went in there, and it was a massacre. They killed, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of Christians were killed, and they actually conquered the Holy Land for Khosrau II. And so that's what happened. So there you see a map of how the Persians expanded into the Byzantine territory and conquered the Holy Land. So Nehemiah ben Hushiel and his followers were very happy at this point. They had taken over the Holy Land. And Nehemiah and his followers established something called the Council of the Righteous in Jerusalem, and immediately started clearing the Temple Mount, which was prohibited for prayer by the Christians. The exact dome where the Dome of the Rock is now, that stone underneath was prohibited as a place of worship for Christians. But the Jews under Nehemiah ben Hushiel set about trying to clear the Temple Mount and establish their Council of the Righteous. That's called a Ma'amed, not Muhammad. It's just a Hebrew word, Ma'amed. It's also pronounced in Sephardic pronunciation. It's called Muhammad, sorry. And that actually means a council, a ruling council of the Jews. So they established themselves in Jerusalem. But then what seems to happen is that Khosrau II declares himself to be the greatest of gods. And you may know, if you're familiar with the history of the Jews, that we don't react very well when a leader starts declaring himself God and demands that we accept or recognize him as God. So you can imagine that Nehemiah ben Hushiel, being a very strict literalist with regards to the Bible, wasn't going to have any of that, and objected to we understand, this is not written, but we understand obviously, contextually, he clearly objected to the idea of Khosrau II being the greatest god, and that's Yazadta, and he and his people became what can you say, persona non grata, or personae non grata from Khosrau's point of view. They were suddenly very he wanted to get rid of them, so he exiled them from the Holy Land, from the Temple Mount, and the Holy Land as a whole, and the Jews were exiled, and they went, and they, according to Sabios, they went and barricaded themselves up in Edessa. And that was around the year, probably around the year 617, 618. They went and barricaded themselves up in Edessa. So I've just described to you the story of what was happening in the West. So there was a successful conquest of the Holy Land, followed by an exile just a few years later, and the Jews had to get out and barricade themselves up in Edessa. So now, meanwhile, there was a movement happening in the East.
Joe, can I just interrupt real quickly here? All of this history that you've done so far comes from what sources?
These are from Jewish sources, from Karaite sources themselves.
But now you're moving. Now you're going to move into Tabari, so you're now moved to 10th century Islamic sources.
Well, Pur Shariati has written a lot about this. But yes, to just give a picture of what things are what starts to be happening. Meanwhile, in the East, I just need to give a little bit of a kind of a background of what was happening in the East. So in the East, meanwhile, in Hira, you know the story we've heard from, and the most sort of comprehensive discussion of what was happening in his sources is Tabari, who is an Abbasid source, and so therefore we can't necessarily trust everything that he's saying. It's going to be influenced by an Abbasid agenda. The Abbasid agenda clearly is that. Sorry.
Just so people are aware where you're getting this next material, where it's coming from.
So Tabari, mainly from Tabari. And the Abbasid agenda, of course, is that Islam began miraculously with a prophet and miraculous conquests. They play down a lot something which is discussed in Tabari called the Battle of the Kar. It's almost invisible in the Islamic histories. Everything else is much more important than this. But from Pur Shariati and other sort of secular scholars have suggested that this is actually the most important battle there was, because if you take the religion or the religious narrative out of the story, what we have is that the first battle of independence against the Persians among the Arabs. That's what it's actually describing, which is about the same time that we're talking about the start of the Year of the Arabs. Remember, we know that there is a Year of the Arabs which begins. Just the thing is, nobody can agree on what the Year of the Arabs was. And sometimes
you're referring to 622, the year of the Arabs.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's sometimes
and that's why 622 is still considered, that's the year for the Hijrah according to the standard Islamic narrative.
According to the Islamic narrative, that's right. But then there are slightly different opinions on when that might have been exactly, because we have some sources suggesting that something was happening around 618. But nevertheless, there's about a 5-year discrepancy between some sources. But between 618 and 622, we have the Year of the Arabs beginning, which the secular explanation for this is really, it was to do with the Battle of the Kar, basically a sort of independence movement, revolution amongst the Arabs against the Persian Empire. And we have that Chinese source as well, from the Ju Tang Shu, which talks about the origins of the Arab state, with this interesting story where some lion man gives an armory to some camel herder in Persia. And this story is what allows us to use Tabari, because this is an independent Chinese source about the origins of the Arab state. And it was recorded in the year 651. It was recorded in the year 651. So the interesting thing is that it was recorded in the year 651, the Ju Tang Shu. Although the Ju Tang Shu's records come much later, the fact is that that was a record which was copied down and first came to China in the year 651 from the envoys of the Arab state. And they say that their state began with this strange story. I mean, at least the way it survived in Chinese records is that there was this strange story, this lion man providing an armory for a camel herder in Persia. Now, lions are a symbol of imperial power, royal power, even all around the world. So that can just mean that some royal guy gave an armory to some not so royal guy, a common guy. Maybe he was a rich person where camel herders were rich. but he wasn't a nobleman. So a nobleman gave an armory to a rich man in Persia. Now, as I said, this is what allows us to use Tabari, because Tabari makes reference to this story. He makes reference to the last Lakhmid king, Nu'man, giving his armory to somebody called Hani ibn Qabisa. Hani ibn Qabisa. Okay, and this leads to the Battle of the Kar, the battle where the Arabs gained their first independence from the Persians, which is around this time, the origin of the Arab calendar. So what happens is that Hani ibn Qabisa inherits this armory from the last Lakhmid king. And then Khosrau, when he has the Lakhmid king killed, he wants his governor, Khosrau wants his governor in Hira to go and find out what happened to this armory and get it back. The governor in Hira, you know his name, Iyas ibn Qabisa. It's quite interesting that they're both called Ibn Qabisa, but they're on opposite sides. That's very interesting. Now, Iyas ibn Qabisa in Tabari is not given a genealogy. They just call him Altai, which could just be, if Tabari is using Aramaic sources or Persian sources, he could just simply be translating the Persian word Tazig into Arabic as Altai, or he could be translating the Aramaic word Tayaya into Arabic as Altai, and he's not giving a genealogy for him. Now we know that these words, Tazig in Persian just means basically Arabs, and Tayaya in Aramaic just means basically Arabs. So essentially it could have just said Iyas the Arab. So Iyas ibn Qabisa the Arab, and that's being translated as Iyas ibn Qabisa Altai. They don't give any more genealogy for him, and that's typical in Arabic sources. When they have a bad guy, they don't like to give him any genealogy, because it's like they're saying this is a guy who has no family history. They don't want to acknowledge his family. They don't want to insult his family by making reference to him as a bad guy, so they don't give a genealogy often for the bad guys. Meanwhile, Hani ibn Qabisa has a massive genealogy. It's huge. It goes on for name upon name upon name upon name. So Hani has a great genealogy, but Iyas doesn't. Iyas is the bad guy because he's the governor of Hira working for Khosrau, while Hani ibn Qabisa is the one who receives the armory from the Lakhmid king. And when Iyas contacts or sends a message somehow to Hani saying, hand over the armory, Hani says no. And as a result, Khosrau decides upon war against Hani. The interesting thing is that Hani is the leader of a tribe of Arabs, a very powerful and important tribe of Arabs in the north. And this is in Iraq, obviously, we're talking about in Iraq. And you'll never guess what the name of that tribe is. It's called the Bakr tribe, the Bakr. So Hani is the leader of the Bakr. The leader of the Bakr. Now we have this title where you have for example, the leader of the Hanifs would be called Abu Hanifa. He's the leader of the Hanifians. Abu Hanifa, leader of the Hanifians. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that Abu Hanifa has a son called Hanifa. It's just a title meaning the leader of, or the father of this group. Father of, it literally means father of, but when they don't have a son called Hanifa, which is plural anyway, we know that that's not the case. So the leader of the Bakr people can be called, legitimately, can be called the Abu Bakr, the father of the Bakr. So Hani ibn Qabisa would be the first known Abu Bakr, the first known father of the Bakrs. So Hani is the leader of the Bakrs. He says, no, I'm not going to hand over the armory. And Khosrau decides to go to war against him. And so they go to war. An advisor says to Hani, how about we use the armory which Nu'man, the king Al-Nu'man left for us. Let's use that armory for our soldiers. So Hani agrees, they dress up the soldiers, but when Hani sees the power of the army coming for him, he panics and he gets cold feet. But he has two commanders, which it says one under his left hand and one under his right hand. And the one under his left hand, his name is Hanzala. Hanzala inspires the troops and gives them a lot of courage by reciting poetry for them. And they win the battle. Tabari says that they have a battle cry at this time, and the battle cry is Ya Muhammad, Ya Muhammad. And this could have been inserted by the Abbasids, but it's worthwhile mentioning because we do have references from the 7th century King's List of Jacob of Edessa to Muhammad, appearing about the same time as this Battle of the Kar. At least the Arabs were united under a concept of Muhammad. Now, I will come to that later because there's no indication that this is a prophet or anything to do with religion other than Christianity, or at least Messianic Hebrew religion, and I'll explain that later. But for now, this Ya Muhammad could simply be a reference to Jesus Christ, and it could be a reference to the Messianic Hebrew religion of those people who were fighting against the Persians. Bear in mind, of course, this could simply be inserted because it's an Abbasid source we're talking about, and they could simply have inserted this into the battle because there is no reference to Muhammad in the battle. This is Islamic history, and they had to. They felt like they had to mention something, so they put in the battle cry Ya Muhammad into that. But apart from that battle cry, there's no mention of religion or Muhammad or anything like that. But what we know is that Hanzala becomes the next leader after Hani. So Hani ibn Qabisa very quickly is replaced by Hanzala, who becomes the next Abu Bakr. And that is the origin of the independent Arab state, which we call Tajikistan. And I have a picture of Tajikistan, just to remind us what we're talking about when we're talking about Tajikistan. So there we have the origin of the first independent Arab state in Mesopotamia. There it is, it's called Tajikistan, and that's the one that Sebios refers to. So the Arabs gained their independence from Persia at the Battle of the Kar under the leadership of Hani ibn Qabisa, followed by Hanzala. They were both leaders of the Bakr tribe. And that's the origins of the independent Arab state, which explains why we have a reference to an Arab king called Abu Bakr in a 7th century source, who doesn't last long. But the thing is, which Abu Bakr? We don't know, because any leader of the Bakr tribe could have been the Abu Bakr. It's not necessary to go to Islamic sources and say that there was a person called Abu Bakr who existed. There were plenty of people called Abu Bakr who could have existed. Anybody who was leading the Bakr tribe, or perhaps even any leader of Tajikistan at that time, could be called an Abu Bakr, since the Bakr were the leading Arab tribe which led the Arabs to independence from Persia.
So this is nothing more than a title, is what you're saying.
It's nothing more than a title for a king of the Bakr tribe, and this has got nothing to do with religion so far. That's what was happening in the East. Meanwhile, the Jews of Jerusalem had been evicted and had gone and sort of garrisoned themselves up in Edessa, which is up here.
In southern Turkey.
In southern Turkey. And then what happens is Emperor Heraclius sets out on his campaign across Persia. Now, Burshariati goes into a lot of detail about how the Arabs started to gain independence from Persia in a long series of battles at this time. And she's the expert on that, so I'm not going to question her. And it's got nothing to do with religion. But at the same time, Heraclius is campaigning across, and he goes and he conquers the Ctesiphon. Well, actually what happens is Khosrau's son, who is actually a monophysite Christian, has a revolution against Khosrau. Probably he has some support or some kind of special groups, money, I don't know, some kind of support sent to him from Heraclius. And Heraclius has a revolution against Khosrau. Khosrau is overthrown. Kavod, the son of Khosrau, is called Kavod. He establishes himself on the throne and immediately surrenders to Heraclius. So Heraclius, for a short time, becomes Shahanshah, King of Kings, of the Persian and Byzantine Empire, but it's just for a matter of months. But he rules the entire Persian and Byzantine Empire. But he allows, he drops that title, and he allows Kavod to be the ruler of Persia under certain terms of surrender. So
well, can we get dates here? What dates are we looking at right now? Heraclius dates are what? First of all, Heraclius dates coming in and destroying Persia is what date?
628.
So that's 628.
So, so here we go. There we have it, Tajikistan. Now, interestingly, what happens next in the same area, the next ruler we know of in that area of Tajikistan, who happens to be based in Nisibis, Nusaybin, which I've talked about with Jay before in my previous videos, which is about here, where I'm pointing on the map right now, Nusaybin. The next ruler of this area is called Hormizd VI, and he mints coins. He sets himself up as a rival Shah opposing the Persian Shah, that's Kavod and his successors, who are in Ctesiphon. So here we have a picture of Hormizd's coin. This is Hormizd VI's coin, and he's based in Nisibis. There's Nisibis here. It says Nisibin, which is Nusaybin here. And here, this territorial area here is the outline of all of the different Bakr tribes. So the Bakr tribes were allegedly, according to the Abbasid sources, they were settled there later. But we can hardly trust anything that's been through the Abbasid's hands unless there's an independent corroboration for it. And the independent corroboration we have, at least, is that Tajikistan was the state of the Arabs, and this roughly is corresponding to the northern parts of Tajikistan. So this is the Wikipedia page of Hormizd VI, and this is the coin they have up here of him, and the dates they have put down are 630 to 632. Wikipedia you should never trust exactly, because it's only a springboard to sort of, you start with Wikipedia and you go deeper. But since I don't have anything else to show about it visually with me right now, I can only show these pictures and these dates from Wikipedia. But he's in the right place at the right time to be another Abu Bakr, another leader of the Bakr tribe, which I showed you the map of where he was just a few seconds ago. So, and he dies in 632. That's interesting, isn't it? Because 632 is the date that Muhammad died in the standard Islamic narrative, and we have a leader of the area of Tajikistan who died in 632. And then he would be succeeded by another Abu Bakr, who we don't know. That name is not given, but what we do know is that the standard Islamic narrative calls him As-Sadiq, or the Sadiq, which also, of course, means the Sadducee. So that Abu Bakr is the last of a series of Abu Bakr. So we had Hani ibn Qabisa, then we had Hanzala, then we had this Hormizd person, and then we have a gap from the year 632. We don't know until 634. We don't know, but that would be the years that the standard Islamic narrative give for their Abu Bakr, who is called a Sadducee. So then we have a Sadducee leader, and then that Sadducee leader is replaced by the standard Islamic narrative says Omar.